Today is July 28th, 2026, and somewhere over the Atlantic, two business jets are burning fuel on a 5,000-mile crossing that no executive ever booked. They lifted off from a base in Arizona. They look like the kind of aircraft you would see parked at a private terminal in Scottsdale, polished, narrow, unthreatening. The sort of airframe designed to move 8 people and their luggage in quiet comfort. They are Gulfstreams. And they are flying into the most heavily armed patch of sky on the planet, sliding into formation alongside strategic bombers, stealth fighters, and a wall of aerial refueling tankers stacked over the Middle East like a traffic jam in the stratosphere. They carry no bombs, they carry no missiles. They will not fire a single round in whatever comes next, and they may be more decisive than half the strike aircraft flying beside them. But let's back all the way up, because to understand what just happened, you need to understand what has been building. Over the last several weeks, the sky over the Middle East has been getting crowded in a way that is genuinely difficult to overstate. Not crowded in the sense of a routine deployment rotation. Not crowded in the sense of a scheduled exercise or a show-of-force flyover meant for a press release. Crowded in the sense that if you laid out the order of battle on a single sheet of paper, you would be looking at a few hundred combat aircraft, close to 100 aerial refueling tankers, and 2 full-carrier strike groups sitting offshore with their air wings ready. That is not a posture. That is an accumulation. And accumulations of that size do not happen because a planning staff got enthusiastic. They happen because someone at the top of a chain of command signed off on the assumption that all of it might be needed at once. So people started counting. That is the natural instinct, and it is the instinct that every headline in the last month has fed. Count the airframes, count the tail numbers, count the carriers. Add it up and reach the obvious conclusion, which is that something enormous is being prepared. And then, almost immediately, the counting produces a guess about the target. Because there is one target in Iran that everyone has been circling for years, and it sits under a mountain in the center of the country that the analysts refer to as Pickaxe Mountain, a suspected nuclear-related site excavated so deep beneath solid rock that most of the American arsenal simply cannot reach it. Not most of it in a rhetorical sense, most of it in a physics sense. The rock is the defense. The depth is the armor. So the question writes itself. Is this entire buildup the run-up to that one strike? Hold on to that question, because we are not going to answer it for you. And by the time you understand what you are actually looking at in that sky, you may find that the number, the count, the tally, the thing every headline led with, was the part that lied to you. Start with the 2 Gulfstreams, because they are the thread that unravels the whole picture. Ask yourself the obvious thing. Why would a force assembling for a potential strike campaign spend the fuel, the crew hours, the tanker support, and the tarmac space to fly 2 converted business jets across an entire ocean? They are slower than the fighters. They are more fragile than the bombers. In a straight fight, they are meat. And the answer is that they are not in a straight fight. They are solving a problem that no fighter and no bomber on that ramp can solve for itself. And that observation opens the door to the strangest feature of this entire assembly, the one that almost nobody has commented on. Look down the list of aircraft that have flowed into the theater, and you will notice something that should stop you cold. Almost no 2 of them are the same kind. This is not a stack of copies of the single best airplane America builds. It is not 200 F-35s. It is not a wall of one dominant airframe. It is a deliberately mismatched collection, a menagerie, a set of machines that share almost nothing with each other except a coat of paint and an insignia. Read that again, because it matters more than any headline number. If one aircraft type were genuinely the best answer to the problem, you would build the force out of that aircraft. You would not haul a 50-year-old attack jet designed to kill Soviet tanks into the same theater as the most advanced stealth aircraft ever fielded. You would not fly Cold War tankers alongside brand new ones. You would not bring 2 entirely different strategic bombers with entirely different capability sets. Unless, and this is the whole story, the problem is not one problem. Unless the problem is a dozen problems wearing a single headline. So the honest question was never how many aircraft are over the Middle East. The honest question is why so many different kinds. Because every single one of them exists as the answer to a specific physics problem that the aircraft parked beside it physically cannot solve. That reframe changes everything, and it starts with a rule that no airplane in the history of aviation has ever escaped. There is a contract written into every military aircraft ever designed, and no engineer has ever found a way out of it. You cannot buy stealth, payload, range, and the ability to drill through solid rock on the same airframe. You can have some, you can never have all, and every one of those capabilities is purchased by surrendering another one. Stealth is paid for with payload. A shape that hides from radar is a shape governed by geometry. Flat facets, buried engines, internal weapons bays, no external hardpoints hanging in the airflow, throwing radar energy back at the emitter. That shape has almost no room inside it. So the stealth aircraft carries a fraction of what a conventional aircraft of the same size carries, and every pound of weapon it adds outside that shape erases the very quality it was built around. Payload is paid for with survivability. The airplane that hauls the most is by definition enormous, and enormous means visible, and visible means targetable. You cannot build a machine with the internal volume for tens of thousands of pounds of ordnance and simultaneously make it disappear. Range is paid for with speed, and speed is paid for with fuel. Every gallon of internal fuel is volume that could have been payload, or structure, or sensors, or the shaping that hides the aircraft. Every knot of additional speed multiplies fuel burn against the square of velocity and shreds the endurance you just paid for. This is not a budget problem. This is not a failure of ambition, or procurement, or political will. This is geometry and thermodynamics closing doors behind you as you open one. There is no version of the future in which a sufficiently large check produces the airplane that does everything, because the constraints are not financial. They are physical. And here's the consequence that produces the crowded sky you're looking at right now. The moment a military campaign faces more than one kind of problem simultaneously, and every real campaign always does, a single airplane cannot be the answer. You need a machine tuned for each problem, and those machines will look nothing like each other, because each one was built by surrendering a different set of capabilities. So the crowded sky over the Middle East is not a sign that a force is showing off. It is a confession. It is a measurement of how many separate, unrelated, physically incompatible problems someone believes has to be solved inside the same window of time. The length of the list does not measure how much power has been assembled. It measures how wide the problem has grown. And once you understand that, the cleanest way to read the order of battle is not by which aircraft looks most impressive on a ramp. It is by the specific job each one quietly holds up. There are 3 of those jobs, 3 groups that the entire force falls into, and only the first one is the part anybody photographs. Start with the machines that actually pull the trigger, because that is what everyone means when they say air power, and because the first lesson is sitting right at the front of it. Even inside the striking group, no single aircraft can do the striking. The job is already split 4 or 5 different ways before a single weapon is released, and each of those splits is a different bargain with the same contract. The F-16 configured for the Wild Weasel mission is built to be shot at. That is the mission. Not a poetic description of it, the actual operational concept. The aircraft flies into contested airspace and presents itself as a target attractive enough that an enemy surface-to-air missile battery switches on its fire control radar and commits to an engagement. The instant that radar illuminates, the Weasel puts an AGM-88 harm in the air, and the missile rides straight down the beam to the emitter. It is a duel where you have to let the other side draw first. There is no stealth on that airframe. There's no heavy bomb load. Both were traded away for one extremely dangerous specialty, because you cannot bait a missile site while being invisible to it, and you cannot spend your time hunting radars while hauling a bomber's ordnance. The F-35 sits at almost the opposite end. It is the closest thing in this entire theater to a universal weapon. Stealthy, sensor-rich, capable of flying inside defended airspace and building a map of the enemy's radar network from the inside, while remaining functionally unseen. It fuses what it detects and passes it to everything else on the network. And precisely because it comes closer to universal than anything else in the sky, it proves the rule better than any other aircraft up there. To stay stealthy, its internal bay carries a very small number of weapons. It cannot haul a bomber's load. It cannot carry the one enormous weapon we are going to get to in a moment. It cannot generate the raw electromagnetic power required to blind an entire integrated air defense network from standoff range. Versatile is not the same as universal, and the gap between those 2 words is where the other 200 aircraft in that sky live. The F-22 gave up strike capability almost entirely in exchange for owning the air. It is not a striker, it is the machine that makes sure nothing gets in front of the strikers. Its job is to clear and then hold a volume of sky so completely that the aircraft carrying the actual weapons never have to think about the threat. And the F-15E Strike Eagle is the heavy hauler of the fighter world. A genuine bomb truck with a fighter's speed and reflexes, capable of carrying serious ordnance deep into defended airspace and putting it precisely on hardened targets, operating from a forward base close enough to the fight to keep generating sorties at a high tempo. It accepts the risk of being based within reach of enemy missiles, because proximity is what buys sortie rate, and sortie rate is what buys sustained pressure. Now the 2 heaviest hitters, because together they teach the single sharpest lesson in this entire picture. The B-1B is a bomb truck in the most literal sense available. 75,000 pounds of ordnance, the largest internal weapons load of any bomber in the American fleet. That is enough for 84 Mark 82 general-purpose bombs, or 24 GBU-31 JDAMs in a single pass, delivered by an airframe capable of supersonic flight. It has no stealth. But unlike the fighters, It does not simply absorb that vulnerability by parking itself near the front. A strategic bomber is big, scarce, and expensive enough that you do not stage it inside enemy missile range where it can be destroyed on the ground before it ever flies a mission. So it operates from a base in England and lets its enormous unrefueled reach carry the load in. That distinction is worth sitting with because it is the entire logic of basing compressed into one sentence. A forward fighter accepts frontline risk because its value is sortie rate. A heavy bomber is worth keeping out of reach because its value is irreplaceability. Two aircraft, two completely different answers to the same question about where to stand. And beside the B-1 sits the machine that answers a problem the B-1 cannot even approach. The B-2 is the only aircraft on the planet capable of carrying the 30,000-pound GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, and it carries exactly two of them. That weapon is understood to punch through something in the neighborhood of 200 feet of concrete and considerably less than that through hard granite, well short of the roughly 300 feet of solid rock that a target like Pickaxe Mountain is believed to sit beneath. Read that again. Read it carefully, because this is the sentence that the entire Iran conversation has been dancing around for 3 years. The single most specialized bomb in the American arsenal, carried by the single most expensive aircraft in the American arsenal, two at a time, may not reach the target that the entire buildup is being speculated about. And it is still, by an enormous margin, the closest thing that exists. For anything buried deep beneath hard rock, the rest of American air power, every fighter, every conventional bomber, every cruise missile, every carrier air wing, is functionally useless. Not degraded, not less effective, useless. One airframe carrying one weapon is the only answer that even gets into the conversation, and it may still fall short. That is what a physics-bounded problem looks like. Not a matter of will, not a matter of resolve, not a matter of political appetite. A number, measured in feet of rock, that does not care about any of those things. And the B-1 and the B-2 together define the axis that explains why both had to come. Because the question those two aircraft answer differently is not how much explosive to deliver. It is, where do you put the energy in space? The B-1B spreads it thin across a surface. Dozens of Mark 82s, each detonating shallow, distributed across a footprint measured in acres. That is the correct answer to a target that is broad, exposed, and shallow. A supply depot, a dispersal camp, a field of launchers in the open, a runway, a staging area. You're trying to touch everything inside an area, and you win by coverage. The B-2's GBU-57 does precisely the reverse. It concentrates all 30,000 pounds into a single dense steel spike that penetrates before it detonates. Most of that weight is not explosive at all. Most of it is solid casing, because getting deep is not a blast problem. It is a problem of kinetic energy driven through a very small cross-sectional area. And the only way to win it is mass and velocity focused into a point. Its energy runs down a line, straight into the earth. That is the correct answer to a target that is small, hardened, and buried. A full squadron of B-1Bs emptying every rack onto the top of a mountain would scuff the surface and rearrange some gravel. Not 1 ounce of that energy would reach a room 300 feet down. The math is not close. It is not a matter of enough sorties. Surface energy does not accumulate downward. So the real question was never how many bombs. It was where do you want the energy? Spread across an acre, or driven into one point hundreds of feet beneath it. Two ends of one axis, no airframe ever built bends that axis far enough to cover both, which is why both bombers are in theater. The same material, arranged in space two opposite ways, and neither one able to do the other's job. One spreads its force across an entire wall, the other drives every ounce of it into the head of a single deeply sunk nail. And here is where the story changes completely. Because every machine in that first group, the Weasel, the Driller, the Truck, the Stealth Fighter, the Air Superiority Fighter, is inert without a second group, and not one aircraft in that second group fires a shot. This is the half of the force that carries no strike weapon at all, and without it, the sharp end falls out of the sky. Literally. Start with the tankers, because they are the number that anchored this entire story and the number nobody bothered to interpret. Close to 100 KC-135 Stratotankers and newer KC-46 Pegasuses, flying gas stations. And they exist because a fighter's combat radius is set by a hard, unforgiving ratio. How much fuel it carries against how fast it burns that fuel. From a base kept back beyond the reach of enemy ballistic missiles, which is where you have to keep your aircraft if you want them to still be there tomorrow, the round trip into Iranian airspace and back out is longer than that ratio permits. The fighter flames out before it gets home. That is not a marginal problem you can plan around with better routing. It is an absolute one. And you cannot simply build bigger tanks into the airplane. Internal fuel competes directly with everything else the airframe was optimized around. On a stealth aircraft, volume spent on fuel is volume stolen from the shape that hides it. On a fighter, weight spent on fuel is agility surrendered. The trade is always there. So the cheaper fix, the fix that has defined American air power for 70 years, is to leave the airframe alone and add the fuel in flight. A tanker meets the strike package in safe airspace and tops it off, converting a short combat radius into a long one without redesigning a single fighter. It never fires a weapon. It never appears in a headline. And the moment you remove it, the most advanced combat aircraft ever built become extremely expensive ornaments bolted to a runway. 100 tankers is not a supporting detail. 100 tankers is the entire reason the strike aircraft are relevant. And if you want the sky read this way instead of just counted, subscribe. Because the count is what everyone gives you, and the structure is what almost nobody does. Then there's the machine that goes after the enemy's eyes and ears, and the same target the Wild Weasel attacks, approached from the exact opposite direction. That brings us back to the 2 Gulfstreams from Arizona. The EA-37B does not destroy radars. It defeats them with physics. A radar finds a target by transmitting energy and listening for the sliver of that energy that bounces back off the target. And that returning echo is brutally, almost absurdly faint, because radar energy falls off with the 4th power of distance on the way out and the 4th power again on the way back. Double the range, and the returning signal collapses by a factor of 16. That is the fundamental weakness built into the physics of radar itself, and it has never been solved because it cannot be. The jammer only has to travel that distance once. That asymmetry is everything, because it means a jamming aircraft can sit at the outer edge of hostile airspace, far outside the reach of any surface-to-air missile, and pour so much noise onto the radar's operating frequency that the true echo, that impossibly faint return, drowns completely. The jammer destroys nothing. It simply wins the ratio of signal to noise, and a radar that cannot hear its own echo above the noise floor is blind, regardless of how sophisticated it is, regardless of how new it is, regardless of how much it cost. That is the cleanest proof of this entire argument. Killing a radar with a missile and blinding a radar with a wave are 2 entirely different solutions to one identical problem, and they are carried by 2 entirely different aircraft. A single-seat fighter that has to fly into the threat and a converted business jet that never has to enter it, because no single machine does both jobs well. The F-16 cannot generate that power. The Gulfstream cannot survive that engagement. Both problems are real. Both aircraft came. And that same principle reaches backward in time and rescues the single oldest aircraft in the theater. The A-10 is a Cold War design built to destroy Soviet armor in the Fulda Gap. It is an airframe conceptually 50 years older than the stealth aircraft parked around it. It is slow. It is not remotely stealthy. It is fragile against a modern radar-guided missile. By every metric that flatters a new fighter, it should have been retired a decade ago and its ramp space given to something else. It stays because it still does one job more cheaply than anything newer. Low, sustained, close support delivered from an airframe wrapped in titanium armor, rugged enough to absorb serious damage and keep flying. Its persistent weakness was always exactly the thing the Wild Weasels are sent to clear: modern integrated air defenses that can see it coming and kill it at range. So in this deployment, it carries the same jamming trick in a pod: an adaptive electronic warfare system that senses hostile emissions and generates countermeasures against them in real time, learning and adapting to frequencies in the air rather than relying on a threat library loaded before takeoff. An old airframe handed a brand new answer to the one vulnerability that the passing decades had turned against it. Survival purchased not with a new airplane costing $80 million, but with a wave. Behind all of that sit the aircraft that see and connect, and they earn their place with one blunt fact of geometry that no technology has ever repealed. The higher you place a sensor or a radio relay, the farther over the curve of the Earth it reaches. That is all of it. That is the entire justification. So the E3G AWACS and the E11A fly high and hold a coherent radar picture and a functioning data link across a battle space hundreds of miles across, while the P8A Poseidon works the water below, tracking surface and subsurface threats in the Gulf and the Arabian Sea. They are the theater's nervous system. Sever it, and every sharp point in the striking group goes blind and mute simultaneously. Not degraded, disconnected. A stealth fighter with no data link is a very expensive aircraft with a very short range and one pilot's eyeballs. Strip away the assumption that a weapon is something that fires, and you discover that roughly half of this enormous force fires nothing whatsoever, and that half determines whether the other half functionally exists. 100 tankers, 0 rounds between all of them, and they are among the most decisive assets in the entire theater. Call them support, and you have already misread the picture. They are not supporting the strike. They are the precondition the strike is built on top of. But the sharp end and the invisible half both have to launch from somewhere. They need a floor to take off from, and they need to still be alive when the order comes. And that floor is precisely what thousands of Iranian ballistic missiles and one-way attack drones are aimed at. Which brings us to the third group, the part of this force that keeps it alive and gives it somewhere to stand. Everything described so far counts for nothing until 2 additional problems are solved. The force has to survive saturation attack before it can strike at all, and it has to launch from somewhere that is simultaneously close enough to the fight to matter and not already sitting in an adversary's fire control computer. Both of those are engineering problems, not questions of resolve. Survival first. Iran has thrown thousands of ballistic missiles and one-way drones at bases in the theater, and the geometry works viciously against the defender. A base in the Gulf sits close enough that a ballistic shot gives under 5 minutes from launch detection to impact. That is not enough time to guarantee a clean intercept, work a second shot, and reassess. So the answer is layered defense, with each tier buying back seconds. THAAD engaging in the high terminal phase, Patriot working beneath it, Aegis-equipped ships providing coverage from the sea. And here's where the arithmetic turns genuinely uncomfortable. Sustaining that defense has already burned through a very large share of the global interceptor stockpile, by some assessments approaching half, with each interceptor costing many multiples of the cheap one-way drone it destroys. That is a losing exchange, measured round by round, and no magazine on Earth survives that trade indefinitely. The defender wins every single engagement and loses the campaign on the spreadsheet. That exhaustion is exactly why the B-1B has a second job in this theater that has nothing to do with the geometry we discussed earlier. It earned its place by spreading energy across a wide area, but it also answers the magazine crunch directly. A plain Mark 82 iron bomb released from altitude costs a small fraction of a guided JASSM or a Tomahawk. So when the precision magazine starts running thin, gravity bombs delivered by a heavy bomber let you keep the operational tempo up without spending the last of the smart rounds on targets that do not require them. One airframe, two entirely unrelated jobs. And it still cannot touch a target buried under a mountain, which is why the B-2 is not optional. One frame can cover more than one problem. No frame covers them all. Now the floor itself. A ground base cannot move, and a target that cannot move is not really a target at all. It is a set of coordinates sitting permanently in a fire control computer. Solve the aiming problem once, and it stays solved forever, in perpetuity, at no additional cost to the attacker. The only way to break that is to make the runway move, and that job falls to the two carriers offshore, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS George H.W. Bush. The carrier steams at better than 30 knots, which means the circle of ocean it could possibly be hiding in expands by hundreds of square miles for every hour that passes since it was last positively located. To strike it, an adversary has to find it first, every single time, inside a search window that grows continuously while the targeting cycle runs. That is the entire trick of 4.5 acres of flight deck that floats. Not that it is armored. It is not armored enough. Not that it is invulnerable. It is not. But that it refuses to hold still long enough to become a coordinate. From those decks fly the naval airframes built specifically for that environment. The FA-18EF Super Hornet, the carrier variant F-35C, the EA-18G Growler, the E-2D Hawkeye. Every one of them trading away some range and some payload in exchange for the structural strength to survive a catapult shot and an arrested landing. A trade no land-based aircraft ever has to make, and one that costs real capability on every sortie. But the moving floor does not replace the land base. It answers a problem the land base cannot answer: fixed ground buys, long runways, deep magazines, heavy maintenance infrastructure, and a sortie generation rate no flight deck can match, which is precisely why the heaviest aircraft still launch from land. The carrier buys presence you can position anywhere and then hide, and it pays for that with aircraft count and with throw weight. One more trade, not a winner over the other. The whole thing reads like a sniper shot. The round is what everyone watches. But the shot only exists because of the footing beneath the shooter and the cover over their head. Here, the footing is a 100,000-ton airfield that swims, and the cover is a magazine of interceptors, individually worth far more than the drones they are being spent on. So strip away the assumption that the strike wins the war, and something quieter surfaces. Most of the costliest hardware in that theater did not deploy in order to attack anything. It deployed to keep the force standing and to give it a place to stand from. Two foundational problems, and not a single strike aircraft in the inventory solves either one for itself. And now set all three groups side by side, because this is where the three pressure tracks converge and where the real picture finally resolves. Track 1 is financial, and it is running against the defender. Every interceptor fired at a drone is a losing exchange by unit cost, and the stockpile is finite in a way that production lines cannot fix inside a campaign timeline. Track 2 is military, and it is running in a very specific direction: the accumulation of specialized capability against a small number of targets that only one platform can reach. Track 3 is psychological, and it is the loudest of the three, because the visible mass of that buildup is itself a message, communicated to an adversary that has to read the same order of battle you are reading and draw its own conclusions about intent. All three are compounding simultaneously. The financial track imposes a clock. The military track produces a capability that expires if the force cannot be sustained in place. And the psychological track means that every day the buildup persists without resolution. The pressure to justify it increases on one side, and the pressure to preempt it increases on the other. Any one of those alone is manageable. The convergence is what changes the character of the situation, because it means the window in which this posture makes sense is not open indefinitely. Force concentrations of this scale are expensive to maintain and politically difficult to walk back. And underneath all of it sits the command architecture question, which is the part that almost never makes the coverage. On paper, the chain runs cleanly from National Command Authority through the Regional Combatant Command down to the air component and the Carrier Strike Group commanders. In practice, a force this heterogeneous is a coordination problem before it is anything else. Tanker tracks have to be deconflicted against strike packages. Electronic warfare has to be timed against the moment stealth aircraft are inside the threat envelope, because jamming announces that something is happening. Suppression sorties have to precede the vulnerable aircraft by a window measured in minutes. The air tasking order that governs all of it is a document of enormous complexity. And the thing that makes it work is not any individual platform. It is the integration. Which brings us to the honest strategic assessment, the part where the official narratives from both sides get set aside. Every machine in that sky would be required to reach a target buried under a mountain. Every single one. The tankers to get the strikers there, the jammers to blind the network, the weasels to kill what the jammers cannot suppress, the air superiority fighters to hold the corridor, the airborne command and control to tie it together, the interceptor umbrella to keep the bases alive long enough to generate the sorties, and the B-2s, because nothing else on Earth carries that weapon. And every single one of those machines is also required for a dozen other missions that have nothing whatsoever to do with that mountain. Defending bases, deterring escalation, protecting shipping, supporting partners, maintaining the ability to respond to something entirely unrelated. The hardware answers to both readings. It will not settle the question for you, and anyone telling you the order of battle proves intent is reading a capability list as though it were a decision memo, whether that mountain is the target lives inside someone's head, not inside the formation. That one is yours to sit with, and that is how the number lied. Counting the aircraft told you the force was big. It could not tell you the force was diverse, and the diversity is the entire story. Because here's the structural risk that should keep you up at night, and it is not the one in the headlines. Every strength added to that force is also a condition added to it. One more thing that has to work before anything else means anything at all. A force that is good at exactly one thing has a single point of failure, and the adversary needs one answer to bring it down. A force that is good at 10 things can solve 10 problems, and that is genuine, enormous strength. But it now leans on 10 separate links. And any strike only lands if the tanker flew, and the jammer blinded, and the suppression package cleared the corridor, and the data link held, and the shield over the base absorbed the barrage that morning. The same roster that reads forward as a catalog of capabilities reads backward as a list of things that cannot be allowed to fail. Diversity buys the ability to solve more problems, and it pays for that in brittleness. They are the same rope, read in two directions. Go back to those two Gulfstreams, 5,000 miles from home, converted business jets sliding into a sky thick with bombers and fighters and 100 tankers. At the start of this, they looked absurd, out of place, a rounding error in a count that ran into the hundreds. Now you can see exactly why they belong, and why their absence would matter more than the absence of a dozen fighters. They answer something no fighter and no bomber can answer for itself. And every other shape in that sky is up there for precisely the same reason, each one holding up a corner that nothing else holds up. The picture was never about one weapon. It was never really about the count. It is the answer to a single question. How many separate physics problems have to be solved at the same moment? And the length of the answer is the size of the question. So the thing worth carrying out of all of this is not whether a strike is coming. It is this: a force whose strength is measured by the number of different links it can chain together. Is that stronger than a simple one, or more fragile? The very quality that lets it solve every problem at once is the quality that gives it that many more places to break. And no amount of counting the aircraft will ever tell you which one you are looking at. The mountain has not moved. The rock is still 300 feet thick. The aircraft are still arriving.